Greetings, gentle viewers, and welcome to Vlogmas Day 2 with the Rewatcher's Diary, where I will dive into the Enneagram types of the main 6 Avengers: Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, Black Widow, Hawkeye, and Hulk. Let's get started. First of all, we're going to start with the team leader, Captain America, who I think is a Type 1, specifically a Type 1 Wing 9. Steve is a great example of a Type 1 who has his own internal moral code. He doesn't just go by what the government says, but what he feels in his gut is the right thing to do. He struggles with resentment throughout his character arc, even in Captain America the First Avenger. He always wanted to do more than just collect scrap metal. And one moment that stands out in Captain America the First Avenger is when Dr. Erskine asks Steve why he wants to fight in the war so much. Steve says he doesn't like bullies, and Type 1s are all about making sure justice gets done. More often than not, I think Steve is a Type 1 Wing 9 because he desires to have a peaceful life, as well as the desire to be good. And he has a lot of times where he shows his natural diplomatic skills. There's a reason he's the leader of the Avengers. Under stress, Type 1s act like the unhealthy side of a Type 4. Now, Steve rarely, if ever, shows signs of envy, but during his pre-serum days, he was kind of jealous of Bucky, who got to go off and fight in the war. And during the post-serum segment of Captain America, the First Avenger, Peggy points out how Steve wanted to do more than just be a lab rat or a dancing monkey. Whenever Steve is stressed, like how he acted during the barnyard bits in Age of Ultron, he tended to get all moody and frustrated, which is typical Type 4 stress pattern. Now, in growth, Type 1s go into the Type 7 arrow, which is very prominent in Avengers Endgame, where post Thanos, Captain America had to travel back in time and fight his 2012 era self. And it's kind of hilarious how future Steve got so annoyed at his past self. And I loved how Steve became so much more spontaneous and open-minded because he was going into this plan that wasn't 100% one of his own making. And he earned his happy ending by choosing to stay in the past. Moving on to Iron Man, I honestly had a hard time figuring out what type Tony Stark was because he acts a lot like a Type 3 and he also acts like a Type 7. But this is going to be me arguing that in actuality, Iron Man is a Type 8 Wing 7. Tony Stark's main issue throughout his movies and the MCU as a whole is this fear of being vulnerable, ever since that very traumatic incident that happened to him in the first Iron Man movie. In Age of Ultron, Tony literally says that he wants to put a suit of armor around the world. He has this constant desire to protect the underdog while avoiding being vulnerable himself. He has this constant need for intensity, control, and self-extension. He constantly needs to push everything and assert himself. One small instance of Tony acting like a Type 8 is in the first Avengers movie, where he kind of constantly tests Bruce Banner's limits when he poked Bruce with that electric prod thing. Tony Stark has no chill whatsoever. He's bombastic and bold, and if I had to pick a wing for him, he is totally an 8 Wing 7 because his behaviors throughout the MCU show instances of the Type 8's vice of lust combining with the Type 7's vice of gluttony. He developed this image of being reckless and impulsive. And like all Type 8s, he deals with this underlying anger that has been a problem for him ever since before he became Iron Man. His issues with his father, the lack of closure about his parents' death, the anger that he felt when he found out that Bucky killed his parents. He couldn't think straight. He'd just go straight to attacking Bucky. That's all within the behaviors and tendencies of a Type 8 with a 7 wing. He's very aggressive. When under stress, Tony acts like the unhealthy side of a type 5. So whenever he acts paranoid or whenever he starts to isolate himself from everyone else, that's when Tony gets into that type 5 stress arrow. Type 8s in growth go into the healthier side of a type 2. And this shows whenever Tony is more willing to work together with the other Avengers and allows himself to be vulnerable, which happens a lot of times throughout the Iron Man movies and the MCU as a whole. But I think the ultimate example of Tony going into that type 2 growth is when he makes the sacrifice play in Avengers Endgame. Yes, he allowed himself to be vulnerable by having a family, having a daughter, and they're all wonderful things, but he still chose to isolate himself during that 5-year gap in between the snap and the events of Avengers Endgame. When Tony chooses to sacrifice his life for the sake of saving the world in Avengers Endgame, I feel like that's the ultimate example of a positive type 2, because type 2s are very into giving of themselves for the sake of others. Now, my information for Thor's particular Enneagram type comes from Laura Crone on YouTube, whose video I will link down below, along with a video she made for one other Avenger whose Enneagram type I totally agree with, but I'll mention that later. Anyway, I think that Thor is a type 3 wing 2. Thor cements himself on the image and the roles that he plays in life, how other people perceive him. He's constantly driven by the desire to be worthy of love, which is basically represented by his need to have Mjolnir, because Mjolnir represents worthiness to him. In the case of a type 3 wing 2, the type 3 wing 2 is motivated by the type 3's focus on image and the type 2's focus on love. Thor's motivations throughout his movies and the MCU as a whole is that he wants to be worthy of being king of Asgard. He starts out as this arrogant, meddling, self-righteous man-child, and in some ways, given how things ended in Avengers Endgame, he still kind of is, but he's gotten a lot better than how he was during his solo movie. His motivation is rooted in the ways that others perceive him, the opinions that other people have of him, and he wants to make sure that he's always the hero. Under stress, type 3s go to the unhealthy side of a type 9, and the most obvious example of this is how Thor acted during Avengers Endgame, where he isolates himself and basically spends his days drinking beer and playing video games. I honestly don't blame him, given all the things that happened leading up to Avengers Endgame, but we don't really see how Thor gets to recover from all that trauma and go back into a healthier level of development. I'm really hoping that will change with Thor Love and Thunder, but we will have to wait and see for that. In contrast, type 3s go to the healthier side of a type 6 in growth, and the best evidence of this is in Thor Ragnarok. Without his hammer, Thor leans into the type 6 growth pattern by relying on Valkyrie, Bruce Banner, and even Loki to help him get out of the edge of the world, get out of the collector's gladiator games. He assembles his team, which he calls their Avengers, which I think is so cool, and he sets his mind towards saving the people of Asgard, all of which is a very type 6 thing to do. Cooperative-minded things, you know? Now, there are two type 6s in the Avengers main team, Black Widow and Hawkeye. I think that they are both type 6, but they have different wings and they represent different levels of phobic and counterphobic. And I'll explain what I mean when I talk about them individually. Black Widow is a type 6 wing 5 counterphobic, and Funky MBTI's blog really describes how Natasha shows her type 6ness the best on the blog. I will link the blog entry here in the description. But basically, Natasha puts on a bold, courageous front of defensiveness and fearlessness, counterphobic 6, but underneath it, she's way more protective of her family than she lets on. For Natasha, she really focuses on finding security within a group, whether it be the family that she had during her youth, or the KGB, or the Avengers or Shield, and all of them are forms of community. She stays in a hub, keeping track of them all, and provides them what they need, a job no one else would want to do, just to keep them all connected. She acts defensively to keep herself and others safe, and is most loyal to the people she cares most about, even willing to go up against other Avengers and fight them off, like how she decided to stick with Iron Man and yet helps out Captain America in Captain America Civil War. Yes, she plays both sides, but I think it's because she really just wants the group to come back together and she sees a bigger picture. She hung around Captain America long enough to trust him, and I think she initially sided with Tony just to keep him accountable. All of this stuff is very type 6. She's loyal, and yet she wants to keep her circle of friends accountable for their actions. She has a soft, humane side that Melina comments on as being remarkable. Despite being a ruthless assassin, Natasha has managed to retain her humanity. She's warm, likable, and sometimes emotional under pressure, and she's also something of a loner, self reliant, and tries to do fine on her own. Under stress, type 6s act like the unhealthy side of a type 3, where they act very arrogant. I feel like Natasha has a tendency to act like she has it all together when in reality she doesn't. She sometimes acts like this around her family, for example, when she gets all argumentative and acts like she knows better than her sister about things. Like the way that Yelena jokes about Natasha's posing, I feel like that's a bit of a type 3 tendency. But usually Natasha is cooler under pressure, and whenever she deals with a stressful situation, she doesn't actually act like a type 3 as much as just go more into that phobic side of a type 6 where she's really scared. There's actually more instances of Natasha going into her type 9 growth arrow, where she trusts the people that she's around with. When she's around Yelena or Steve or Bruce, she's a lot more relaxed. I feel like her actions in Captain America and the Winter Soldier during that part where they have to take down Hydra is a really good example of Natasha going into that healthier side of the type 9. Now, in contrast, Hawkeye is a type 6 wing 7 who's phobic. Hawkeye is the marksman who has a trick arrow for any and every situation, and if there's one thing that's associated with type 6s is that they're prepared for any and all worst case scenario. I think that the Hawkeye series really shows a lot of Hawkeye's type 6 tendencies. He's not the one who's in charge of the team, but he keeps everyone in check. He keeps an eye on the bigger picture of things, and he's very much a team player. Under stress, type 6s go into the type 3, and I think Hawkeye shows a better example of the type 6 going into the type 3 stress arrow when he becomes Ronin. To quote Funky MBTI, type 6s put on a facade of competence to dull their anxiety and impress others with how together they are, but refuse to do anything they doubt they can succeed at or take unnecessary risks. So when Hawkeye became Ronin, he wanted to be in full control of what he was doing. He was angry, he was putting on this facade of being a ruthless killer, going around killing all sorts of people all over the world because he was so mad that Thanos' snap apparently didn't kill off the right people. He became arrogant with this whole god complex, choosing to decide who lives or who dies. In contrast, Clint shows a lot of different ways of showing his type 9 growth pattern. There's actually a lot of instances in Age of Ultron and small moments in the Hawkeye series, where he shows this type 9 tendency to just be more relaxed and trusting. He only acts like this around his family, and I think that moment that he talked to Wanda about becoming an Avenger was a very type 9 thing to do, where he was diffusing her anxiety. And I think the way that Clint is mentoring Kate in the Hawkeye series is also another example of going into his type 9 growth pattern, because he's very patient with her. And side note, I think Kate Bishop is a type 3, and if you want me to go more into her Enneagram type, please comment. But for right now, I really think she's a type 3 because she has this drive to be accomplished, and she talks about Hawkeye's branding, which is a very type 3 thing to say. Last but not least, the Hulk, aka Bruce Banner, who is a type 9 wing 8. And thank you again, Laura Crone, for making a deeper dive on Hulk's Enneagram type. I will link that video she did on the Hulk in the description below. Type 9 wing 8s are called the comfort seekers, and Bruce Banner is a man of simple needs. His character arc throughout the entire MCU is to maintain a balance between his desire for inner peace and the anger that he constantly has to wrestle with. Type 9s are conflict avoided, and Hulk usually tries not to get into fights unless he absolutely has to, which is a contrast to a type 8, which goes straight towards conflict. And like a type 9, Bruce Banner usually sets aside whatever needs he has personally for the sake of the team or for the sake of whatever he has to do in the moment. Under stress, type 9s tend to act like the unhealthy side of a type 6, which is when Bruce can get paranoid, and I think that his fear of being the Hulk permanently and losing his more gentle nature is that sign of a type 6 stress pattern. I feel like Bruce is acting like an unhealthy 6 in Age of Ultron because he has this tendency to be loyal to people who aren't exactly good for him health wise. At least in Age of Ultron, because nobody was really at their best in Age of Ultron aside from Clint. I feel like Bruce also shows Type 3's stagnation when in Thor Ragnarok he clung to this image of being the Hulk. It became his survival mechanism. He, in contrast to how he feared being the Hulk in the earlier stages of the MCU, in Thor Ragnarok, Bruce was more scared of not being the Hulk because he could actually survive out in space. He was lost. He didn't really have anyone, so he had to depend on the Hulk, his type 3, in order to survive. And he didn't know who he was when he wasn't the Hulk during Thor Ragnarok. If you want a good example of Bruce Banner going into his healthier type 3 growth pattern, just look at Avengers Endgame, where he becomes Professor Hulk. The way that he reaches out to Thor in Avengers Endgame, Laura really goes more into detail on that particular scene, shows that Bruce Banner has finally found balance in his life and became more aware of his own needs. So that's the Enneagram types of the Avengers. I hope you enjoyed this video. The next one that I plan to do will be up on Friday, where I will go into the Enneagram types of the B team. Specifically, Sam Wilson, Bucky Barnes, Scott Lang, Spider-Man, Wanda, and Vision. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and ring that notification bell so that you can see the next video as soon as I upload it. Thank you for watching.